Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. On the show today, I have a very special guest who's going to dive into the intersection of science and spirituality. But before that, I want to get some updates out of the way. Firstly, my annual pranayama immersive study program and optional teacher training is starting on January 9th. This is my annual pranayama course that I offer virtually. It's completely online. The classes run for 6 weeks. They are live, but can also be done on replay. I'm getting a lot of questions on Instagram asking if you'll get equal value if you are doing this on replay. You 100% will get the same value whether you are live or whether you are watching it on replay. So if that's your concern, don't worry about it. Every year we have participants who do this on replay. Also, the early bird pricing is ending on December 30th. I'm hosting an information session on January 4th, and the course starts on January 9th. So those are your dates. December 30th, the early bird pricing is ending. Enrollments have been open for the past couple of weeks. I have dropped a few pranayama episodes. In case you haven't heard those, we'll link some of those in the show notes for you so you know you get an idea of what doing pranayama with me feels like. So December 30th, the early bird pricing is ending. January 4th, the online information session where you can come in and ask all your questions, look at the course, look at how it's laid out, understand the syllabus. That's happening on January 4th. The link to sign up for that information session is in the show notes. And the course starts on January 9th. I cannot wait to get you into that room to learn pranayama in a very structured, effective way where you can have a well-structured pranayama practice for yourself. And for those of you who teach, this will bring so much clarity into how to introduce and build your participants into pranayama practice. So I hope that helps. All the details, all the links for everything is in the podcast description as well as in our show notes. I hope you cannot hear Munch barking in the background. There's a delivery guy at the door and he's having a jolly time barking at that fellow. Now, let's get to today's episode. On the show today, I have Dr. Abha Rajbhandari. She is a neuroscientist and also a yoga teacher. She is currently teaching at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York. She obtained her PhD in neuroscience from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and did her postdoc work at the University of California in Los Angeles. Her research largely is focused around the biological mechanisms of the brain and body connection. And in this conversation, we dive into science and spirituality, the intersection with both of them. We talk about the brain, we talk about the nature of consciousness, we talk about what is spirituality according to a scientist, what is science, where do they meet, what are the characteristics for something to be called spiritual. We talk about the practices in yoga, we talk about the actual changes in the brain that happen in and because of the practice of yoga, we talk about meditation and its role and its impact on the brain. We talk about neurochemicals. We talk about so much in today's episode. I have been waiting for a very long time to find a guest who can do justice to this very vast and expansive topic. Some topics are easy to confine, right? And to talk specifically about that. But something like spirituality is so massive. And Dr. Abha effortlessly simplifies it and helps to clarify a lot of questions and gives direction to this conversation. I believe it is of tremendous value to anybody who practices yoga, anyone who teaches yoga. I really enjoy when we as yoga teachers can understand science in simple language. And Dr. Abha does that eloquently in today's episode. I hope you will enjoy this. As always, everything about today's show is linked in our show notes at letstalk.yoga/listen. You can find the link to Dr. Abha's bio, as well as her social links, all of that at letstalk.yoga/listen. Enjoy today's show. I'll see you on the other side. Hi, Abha. Welcome to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast.
Hi, Arundhati. Thank you so much for inviting me to this amazing podcast.
I'm so glad you are here because this is a topic I've been wanting to do for a long time now. And I really was looking for someone to have this conversation with. So, for the listeners to know, we're getting into the intersection of science and spirituality. And in my head, this is a heavy topic. Okay. So where should we begin? Can you define what spirituality is? Is there a textbook definition for this? Because I feel like, especially in modern day yoga, right, it's very loosely interpreted.
Mhm.
So how would you define spirituality?
Sure. Yeah, something I think about a lot. And recently, what I've been thinking about is because if you look at the word spirituality itself, it has one important component there, which is the word spirit. Right. So if you think of the word spirit itself, what does it mean? So if you think about it, spirit means something that's beyond your physical, right, objective sort of domain. So it can relate. So spirit can relate to many different things. So that can be the subjective aspect of yourself. It can also mean something that's beyond what we see in this physical realm, right? So it can be something that's sometimes hard to describe or intangible. And so in that way, I would say spirituality, there isn't a particular definition, but it just means something that allows transcendence over the physical aspects of our being, right? So in that way, it allows then deeper aspects of understanding the mystery of existence itself or life itself. And further on, it can allow a deeper sort of understanding or contemplation of what is beyond this physical domain that we think that life comprises of. Is there more to this, right? Is this all I am, or is there more to myself? So that's what I would say. It includes a lot of those aspects of contemplation and understanding, or even the seeking of understanding of life. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So, are there specific characteristics for something to be called spiritual?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So according to, obviously spirituality cannot be described through science, right? Because they're very different domains, or even in psychological terms, maybe there's a little bit of way we can think about spirituality. So in that way, if we think of spirituality, there are certain characteristics, so for example, this wanting to find meaning and purpose, right? So that is definitely one of the characteristics of spirituality, is it's driven by trying to understand what is beyond this physical domain. And so that way, it comprises those aspects of awe and sort of broader understanding, as well as wonder about what is beyond this physical aspect of our living or life, or even laws of nature, right? Like the fundamental laws of nature that allow existence itself. And so in that way, it can encompass many different things, and it can also be very subjective. But I would say there are characteristics this kind of interconnectedness spirituality allows, is also allowing, aspects of compassion, kindness, feeling that we are all in this together. So those are all characteristics of the spiritual domain, right? You understand, even though physically we may be different, we may look, very different from each other, or we have very different values, goals, ambitions, things like that. At the core, we're all driven by that core sense of wanting to understand who we truly are, right? And so I think those are some of the main characteristics that define spirituality. Through my years of understanding it now, that's what I would say. Mm-hmm.
So, are we born this is our inherent nature? That's how I see it. So we're all born with it. But somewhere along the way, some of us lose sight of it, right? So how does science come in? Firstly, how do we define science?
Yeah, so science and spirituality are quite distinct from each other, right? I would say they're more complementary because science is all about also understanding the nature of life, the purpose of existence, or even the laws of nature, how it all governs, how we live. And so in that way, though, science is more focused on that physical domain or the objective domain, and it utilizes also techniques that are based on those physical aspects, right? So empirical research, or basically trying to understand at that tangible level how we can understand or tear apart, even things, and look to see what it's comprised of, what it is made up of, what is it at the molecular, cellular level, and then trying to put it together for a bigger understanding. So at the core, I think science can be defined as also a path to understanding of nature of reality, but the methodology is different because in that way, it's very empirical sort of way of understanding that.
I feel like a lot of yoga is intangible, right? And it's subjective. And in many ways, no two people will have the same experience at the same time. Whereas science wants, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's a little more tangible. The evidence needs to be seen in many ways. So are there specific scientific parts of yoga that we can talk about? Yeah, let's start there. Then I'll take you a little further into that.
Yeah, sure. This aspect of mind and body connection, or if we look at the physical aspect, the brain and body connection, right? That's a huge way I think science and spirituality come together in this complementary manner, because in both science and spirituality, especially, understanding of our body, our nervous system, our brain has brought this understanding that, especially in neuroscience, right, that, for a long time it was thought that brain is the center of everything, that brain controls everything, and everything else was sort of ignored in a way in neuroscience research. But more and more now, this research area called interoception, which basically means how the brain senses the bodily signals, so coming from the heart, from the gut, from the lungs, all of this information that's coming to the brain is what causes the brain to then produce behaviors and actions and decision making and things like that. And so in that way, now science has understood that our health and well-being is highly dependent on this mind-body or the brain-body connection, right? So understanding how the brain perceives our body allows then for better ways to tap into, this health and well-being. And so that aspect has always been an important part of, I think, all spiritual practice, right? It includes emotional well-being. It includes this mind-body aspect. So once your mind is in control, then you can think about these deeper aspects of yourself, or bring that self-awareness, emotional control, and things like that. So that you can transcend the physical domains, right? So in that way, spirituality is all about that. But now scientific evidence is showing that these kind of practices, like yoga, which is a mind-body practice, allows this connection of the brain and body, but also tangible sort of evidences are coming up, right? For example, there are changes in structure as well as function of brain regions that are important for emotional regulation, for thoughts, as well as for decision making. So like the prefrontal cortex is part of the brain region that's important for critical thinking and decision making, and it produces this inhibition of the brain region that's important for emotional regulation called the amygdala. And so research is now showing that there is dampening of amygdala activity with regular yoga practice, which includes, many different aspects of the yoga practice. And there is increased activation of the prefrontal cortex, which can allow better decision-making through many aspects, right? Attention, and even things like sleep regulation, right? Something simple that's tangible, right? Yoga has allowed many people who suffer from anxiety or other types of mental health conditions to simply sleep better. And just by sleeping, it has had a far-reaching impact on health, including immune regulation, including better, cardiovascular functions and many other things. So these are all tangible aspects that science has been able to measure now, right? And so I think in that way, to answer your question, it's a long answer, but
no,
I
it's
think
fine. It's fascinating for me.
Yeah. So in that way, I think yoga as a practice, is that combination of scientific aspect, even though the scientific aspects are more, in a way, byproduct or side effects, because, the goal of yoga is spiritual, right? It is to transcend beyond the physical. So, but it comes together so nicely for a mind-body practice like yoga.
Wonderful. Is there more, especially when you mentioned the brain? I want to get into the nature of consciousness in a bit, but before that, can we talk about the impact on the brain a little more? Okay. So you mentioned the prefrontal cortex. You mentioned the amygdala. Is there anything that science is really like screaming, saying, look at yoga, what it's doing to your brain?
Yeah, definitely. So, our brain comprises of many different neuronal connections, right? So within a brain region, as well as between brain regions, the way the brain connects with, different parts of itself is through these cells called neurons, right? And so one way yoga has been altering neuronal functions is by altering how, there is neuroplasticity, which means basically, there can be alterations in the connectivity within a brain region. So for example, in the prefrontal cortex, which is important for decision making, there has been found to be more activity of brain neuronal activity, right? Whereas in amygdala, which regulates emotional aspects, so increased amygdala activation is associated with more fear, more stress, but yoga has been shown to cause decrease in amygdala activation. And there are many other studies now showing also this changes in cardiovascular function, including blood pressure. So there is decreased studies showing decrease in blood pressure. There is changes in heart rate, so rhythmicity of the heart. So by slowing down the heart itself, it can now have far-reaching impact on other mental health aspects as well, because heart sends this connection to the brain through the vagus nerve, right? Which is a different topic, but it allows, that interoceptive process to happen better. And so, in terms of even things that have been measured in people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, there are studies that have shown that regular practice of yoga, which includes meditation, is an important component of that. But if it's combined with meditation and asana, meditation and pranayam, any of these combinations has allowed also decrease in things like rumination, negative thoughts. So, by using psychological matrices, they're able to compare this. And so in women, they have found huge effects of yoga practice on things like rumination or ruminative thoughts and things like that. So a lot of, I think, changes in those levels. And then other levels also, there are changes. Yoga's effect has been shown in things like immune functions, right? So they have found, like, when you measure blood levels of people who practice yoga, who don't practice yoga, you can see differences in measures like this stress hormone called cortisol, which is really, decreased in yoga practitioners. And then in looking at the activity of the brain itself using functional imaging resonance, they're able to see specifically blood flow to specific brain regions are changed, or within a network of brain regions are also changed in many different aspects of health and well-being, right? Like attention, sleep, and things like that. So yeah, I would say now there's so much evidence of yoga at that scientific level.
So, I mean, that's fascinating. Thank you. That was, and I know you're just like skimming the surface of some of these things. So essentially what I hear you say is neuroplasticity, the brain actually is becoming younger in some way, where, right? Can I say that? The brain's, you're maintaining it, you're aging well with your brain. I've also heard that it helps you, the more you meditate, it helps you to push further away Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Is that right?
Yeah, there is actually, I'm part of this yoga conference that we do every year where we bring researchers as well as yoga practitioners in one place with a friend of mine who's a neurologist. And we have done topics like yoga for Parkinson's disease, yoga for Alzheimer's disease, yoga for many other topics, right? And so what the research from all of those have shown, I haven't delved too much into specific areas, but more and more evidence is showing, for example, Parkinson's disease, right? Yoga practice, especially involving the asana practice as well as breathing practice, has been shown to allow better coordination of muscle or motor functions. And you can see, right, like even dancing, for example, has been shown to have far-reaching impact on patients who have Parkinson's disease. So definitely from that level, there's more evidence coming out. But I would say right now, for neurological conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, or some other conditions, the data is still coming out. But I would say, it's not quite there to say convincingly that, it has this impact. Okay. But I would say just by having that complementary sort of health benefits of better regulation of emotions, better stress control, and things like that, those itself can have effect on things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cancer as well, and others, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, wonderful. No, and as you're saying this, right, to me, it's so clear. Now, as someone who teaches at the studio, almost every day, a lot of people come in thinking, oh, flexibility. And I think as yoga teachers in asana classes, we need to change the focus and be like, look at what it's doing to your brain. Come for that. Yes, you got 2 more inches in your hamstring length to stretch and fold, but look at what it's doing to your brain. And that's, it needs to be more of what I call popular messaging. So I'm glad that you are telling us in detail as to what all it does. And I hope it appeals to yoga teachers to say this more in asana classes. So what would we then say is the nature or the origin of consciousness? Because at the start of the interview, you were talking about spirituality, right? It is our curiosity to know who we are. It's that inner nature. So it's as old as man himself.
Consciousness.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're bringing a very important as well as very debatable topic in neuroscience.
Oh, okay. I was like, it's more vague in my head, but okay.
Yeah, but it's a very in line with the spiritual and the scientific aspects, right? So consciousness, in fact, in neuroscience is considered a very hard problem to solve because when you think about it, right, like obviously our systems, our brain, our cells, molecules, they all are working together for the proper functioning of the body. But yet it is so hard to understand how these systems and cells and molecules that are functioning together gives rise to consciousness itself, right? Mm-hmm. And so some scientists believe that consciousness is an emergent property of these cells and neurons and systems working together, right? It just emerges out of that, right? And so that's very hard for some to believe. Is it, how does it emerge, right? Then it leads to that question. Then on the other hand, there are neuroscientists who are now in that sort of area or group who are saying that consciousness may just be something that brain expresses. So in that way, brain is just an instrument or vehicle for the consciousness to express itself. So that in a way makes sense, right? So when we alter brain functions, it can alter some aspects of the consciousness, right? That conscious aspect of our emotions, of our cognitive functions, and many others. But it's still very hard to understand because it's not tangible, right? Like you can't measure it. And then there is another area of neuroscientists who believe that consciousness emerged once we humans developed language, right? So once we had language, we had aspects like self-awareness, we were able to put into words, oh, this is the way I'm feeling, or this is my emotions, right? But then that also raises the question, do humans only have consciousness, right? Like, do animals not have consciousness then? Because if you think about language, they have language,
Their
but
own
it's
language, and they have emotion too.
Yes, exactly. And so this is why it's called a hard problem of neuroscience to solve consciousness. There's so many theories, there's so many ways people have tried to measure consciousness. And the closest thing to measure consciousness is when you give someone anesthesia, right? So when you give anesthesia to people, then there is that aspect where you lose touch with your body, just like deep sleep states and things like that. And people start to probe, like, what happens to consciousness and things. But still, it's not very clear. There are many neuroscientists, at Harvard, MIT, who are trying to research this, but that's the only way. So, yeah, I would say then consciousness can have many different meanings, and we can't say it's one thing, in that sort of way, even from a neuroscientific point of view.
Because it is, again, consciousness itself, it's hard to define. While some brave people like you are trying to define it, it is hard to define. So I see the bridge between consciousness and science as meditation. And it's a very simplistic, my version of it, and it may not be the complete version of it. So is meditation the solution, for lack of a better word, to connect with our consciousness in a better way? Or is there something else before meditation?
You are absolutely on point. I think, yeah, so I would say definitely meditation is the best way, because, even in the path of yoga or practice of yoga, the eventual way we reach is like sort of like getting away from the physical, right? Like when we do asana practice, when we do pranayama, yamas, niyamas, those are all associated more with the physical objective aspect. And then when you look at the 4 other aspects, dhyan, dharana, pratyahara, and samadhi, they are internal, right? And so in that way, a lot of the 4 aspects of the physical are in a way preparation to get into that aspect of sitting down for meditation and understanding, right? Like consciousness. And so in that way, because meditation is something that comes after, the aspects where we kind of detach from the physical, it is in a way that allows us to connect with that deeper aspect of ourselves, right? And so from a scientific point of view, you can see, like, when you practice meditation daily, it allows detachment from thoughts, emotions, even stresses, even if it's for a brief period of time, which can then allow you to tap into maybe it's not consciousness, but some other aspect of yourself that's more deeper, right? If we want to put it that way. And meditation is that practice from a spiritual point of view. So in many ways, I think science is also understanding that meditation, which is important for health and well-being, but this balance of spirituality and science that it can bring can actually have a holistic impact on a person's life, right? When you have that combination. So yeah, I would say you are point on that meditation is, I think, that bridge between science and spirituality in so many ways.
Is there a specific way of meditating that you would say is more suitable?
Again, just like spirituality, I feel like meditation is also very subjective, right? Like spirituality itself, if you look at it, it's very subjective practice, right? So many aspects of what we do in spirituality could be based on our culture, our traditions, what we learned, things like that. And similarly, meditation is also part of many different spiritual practices, right? And so, some people find that connection to the higher self through dances like Sufi dances, right? Which includes that connection. Whereas others find it when they detach from everything, go sit in a mountain. Right. And so I don't think I am in a place to recommend or say, right, there is this is the way to connect with your higher self, because I think it's very subjective and it can come through many different things. So that would be my answer. Yeah.
Okay. No, wonderful. I was just, I knew you would probably say, it depends. So what about, you've said a couple of times in this conversation, emotional regulation, right? So is the goal to have less emotional reaction, or is it supposed to increase what we in the modern day label as positive qualities? In yoga, we call them sattvic gunas, right? Compassion, empathy. So is the goal to reduce emotion or to increase or amplify these sattvic qualities in us? I mean, is this an out of syllabus question?
No. I guess from both science and spiritual perspective, right? And so from a scientific angle, right, like I think finding that peace, happiness, balance, harmony, equilibrium, homeostasis, these are all terms that come into science when you talk about emotions, right? Like, so what does being out of balance mean is that, there is more emotional reactions to something that may be, that may not require that level of emotional reactions, right? Like, for example, if you take someone who's experienced trauma and they come to a safe environment away from the place where they've experienced trauma, then something in that safe environment triggers the same memories that they had experienced when they were in the traumatic situations and causes the person to have reactions, right? So the reactions could be at the level of heart rate. So when you think about that traumatic experience, you could have increased heart rate, your breathing could increase, or you could be holding your breath, things like that. And so in that way, what do you want that person to do want from that scientific point of view is to find that equilibrium and go back to natural rhythm of heart rate, natural rhythm of breathing, right? And so a lot of medicine in that way, pharmacological treatments, even cognitive behavior therapy, many of those things are sort of geared towards taking that person out of that emotional state. So when I say emotional state, it's also a big topic, right? Because it includes your thoughts, it includes changes in your bodily functions, not just heart rate and breathing, also immune functions, your gut functions, a lot of those things. And so in that way, yes, I think science is geared towards that. And then spirituality allows that, because it's the process of transcending the physical by understanding that these experiences I'm having are temporary, or maybe something that I don't require to have this level of reaction. So it allows that detachment, or maybe even a little pause between the thought and the action or the reaction, right? So just by allowing, I think, a little pause between the reaction that your body is going to have or your mind is going to have, I think that itself can have that far-reaching impact. So the goal for emotional regulation, then, to answer your question, is not to basically get rid of those emotions, because we need them for survival. We need emotions for survival, fear, anger. A lot of these emotions allowed us humans to evolve in so many ways. But what we do want is we do not want these emotions to come in place when we do not need them, right? And that's what's happening in human society, in the modern society more and more, is we're having these reactions and actions that are not necessary or not appropriate for a particular situation.
Overreact. Yeah.
Yes,
Overreact
exactly.
or underreact. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, wonderful. I'm glad you brought up the pause, right? And I believe a lot of deeper yoga practices, the antarangas, right? The final limbs of yoga, they take us into that pause. They make that pause our default nature. So we always tell people, if you want to know if your yoga is working for you, notice, instead of reacting, are you starting to respond to whatever is brought your way? So I'm glad you brought that up. So emotions is one thing. Now, where does ego come into play here? Because I feel like emotions and ego, they're kind of tied together at many levels. So what happens to the ego in the pursuit of this consciousness?
So ego is, sometimes I think ego gets a bad rap. And now from understanding, more from spiritual texts also, actually, if you, because, ego translated into Sanskrit is ahankar, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how can you, there is a saying like, you can turn your ahankar into aham brahmamsi, which means basically aham means like this yourself, right? Like I am, this inner self, to ahankar means that it has that negative aspect, but actually you can turn your ego and use it towards this goal of understanding your true self. And in that way, it may not be a bad thing. It is a bad thing, I guess, in the way, because if we look at ego in this ego-driven society, right, at the level of leadership, at the level of even our, jobs and things like that, it's driven by how am I gonna be better than another
also
person.
Think patriarchy is in that list somewhere.
Yes, patriarchy, many other things, right? Cultures, diversity, inclusion, a lot of these comes into play. And so a lot of these cause people to be in that state of ego, in the sense like, is how am I going to be better than another person all the time? And that's not necessarily a bad thing in the path of spirituality, I would say. But in the path of other aspects of our life, if all the time it's driven, by that thought, then it can have negative impacts on our health and right? So in that way, I think, you can look at it from that scientific lens and use understanding of ego. Ego can be, I think, only described in more psychological terms in science than, in terms of like brain structures and things like that, because it's also very subjective, right? And from a spiritual point of view, I think, it is that aspect that can be utilized or tapped into for understanding our true self, or, tapping into that level of consciousness.
No, I'm glad you said, ego, ahamkara, whereas look at it as aham. And my yoga studio is actually called Aham Yoga. And the intention behind the aham is, I am yoga. Yoga is your true nature. So it is me returning to my true nature. Or that's what it's meant to mean.
Yeah. That's so big. Yeah.
So it's I am yoga, and yoga being your true nature. So thank you for that clarification, because I feel like emotions, ego, and the layers of the mind and consciousness. I mean, even here, we're referring to consciousness as a very general aspect, right? Are there layers to consciousness that we should know about?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can get into, so much depth about consciousness, from the spiritual aspect, the antakarana, but beyond that also, there's aspects, I would say, lot of that is also a process for me. I don't know if I am in a place to say like, this is what it is like at this moment, because I'm also in the path of understanding it myself from both a scientific lens and a spiritual lens, and to truly grasp it, right? Because a lot of times, from a knowledge point of view, you feel like you get it, but then when you start to think about it deeper, then you're like, I don't get it. Yeah, exactly. So to be honest with you, to get into the layers of, things like buddhi, ahankar, chitta, a lot of those aspects, I think it's not my area of expertise, I would say, right?
Yeah. No, I'm glad you're so honest about it and candid about it, because I like how you said, knowing it is one thing, sitting with it in practice, applying it, trying to work through it, that's a whole different ball game altogether. And this is what I like to sometimes caution practitioners about, or yoga teachers, because that's who I really talk to, is it's not about just gathering information about all of this. That is, you don't need more information. There is no dearth of information available. It's how much of it are you able to take and make an impact on your own life? And in your own inner journey. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So the way I see it, we need to have certain practices or rituals, right? To solidify, for lack of a better word, our link with our own consciousness, whatever label you're putting. So according to you, are there any specific practices, rituals that we need to get into so we look after our brain from a very physical standpoint and we're aging well, and also moving forward in our spiritual journey?
Again, I do want to say that is also something that can be very subjective, right? Like this particular, doing, this set of practices, may work for me, but may not work for another person.
True.
But from that the aspect of spiritual or religious aspect, bringing those components into your practice, that is up to that person. But in terms of the rituals itself, I think what rituals allow you to do, for example, if you're doing japa, dhyana, things like that, where, you're chanting, you're doing a set of rituals, maybe you're bathing like the idols, if you're in Bhakti tradition, if you're doing those, that itself, what it is doing from a scientific perspective, first of all, it is causing you to have this sort of focused attention on something, which then allows other types of thoughts to not enter your brain in a way, right? If you're doing with intention and focus, obviously, sometimes that doesn't happen. But so in that way, ritual is doing that one thing. The second thing rituals do is it's a habit formation. And habit formation is great for the brain, right? So once you have a set of habits, just like brushing your teeth, just like taking a bath, taking, set of things that you do, like you wake up in the morning, you have your breakfast, you do these things. Just like that, if you have certain set of rituals in the morning, in the evening, especially before you go to bed, right after the end of the day, then what that allows is this habit formation. And when you turn to those rituals, practice, which can be many set of things, it can allow release of neurotransmitters or neurochemicals in the brain that are associated with pleasure as well as calmness. So things like oxytocin, dopamine, and endorphins even, those are neurochemicals that have been shown to be associated with habit formation. And so when that happens, your brain is automatically in that state of calmness, and, it allows better regulation of other aspects. You can have better sleep, if you have rituals before you go to bed. And same, when you wake up in the morning, from that scientific as well as spiritual point of view, you're starting your day with an intention, with a focus, right? Like this is how you want to start your day, with a pure sort of mind or state. And so I would say you can make it your own, right? Like rituals, I think, should be part of someone's life, right? Like it is part of that habit. And so just like asana practice or bhakti aspects or any other aspects, if you turn that into this set of rituals, I think it's great for your brain as well as spiritual well-being. So that's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, as you're speaking, I'm reminded of this has existed in Ayurveda, even yoga, for centuries. Right? Your morning set of rituals, your evening set of rituals, and during the day you do certain things, you do it at the same time, you do it day after day, week after week, because they had already figured out this is how we should be living, this is how we should be moving in the world. So it's reinforcing that, because the way I see it, we wake up and we're rushing and we're doing everything urgent. And we've lost that touch to slow down and to just set these few things for ourselves. So I have a couple of questions from what you said. One is, can you talk a little more about the neurochemicals? Because I feel like that's something we see it honestly on Instagram and maybe on YouTube, and that's the knowledge we have about information we have about it. And can you talk about the effect of, and this might be a little off topic, but I'll ask you anyway, the effect of just screens and light in our faces late at night on the brain? Because you said sleep earlier.
Yes.
And, we protect a baby's sleep so strongly, but as adults, we just mess with our own. So can we get into neurochemicals? And let's start there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And very important topic on the screens. I was listening to another podcast about that, how it's changing like human brain itself.
I've been hearing stuff like that too. And yet I find myself with my screen in front of my face every night. So
I know it's like unavoidable, but how do we adapt to it, right? But yeah, in terms of the neurochemicals, right? So our brain basically runs on either electric sort of energy or, this aspect of chemicals, right? Like chemicals are what run the brain. And so chemicals have many different names. So they're called neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, peptides, neuropeptides, things like that. And so they're just different in terms of like their shapes, their functions, and things like that. So the three neuromodulators or neurotransmitters that I was bringing up earlier, dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins, those are very important for many different aspects of our day-to-day life, right? So for example, dopamine, although, in the media, it's called as the pleasure hormone and all of...
You need it though. You need some of it.
But dopamine actually pleasure is, I think, more a byproduct. What does dopamine do is it's important for the motivation to seek reward, right? So we are driven by reward, and that reward can be the rituals we talked about, right? And when you sit down to practice your meditation, your rituals, and a lot of that, in a way, for your brain's perspective, it's like a reward, right? You're having that state of calmness that your brain wants, right? That homeostasis. And so when dopamine gets released in the pursuit of a reward, obviously dopamine is associated with more intense sort of reward-seeking behaviors like drugs, food, alcohol, and things like that, because it causes someone to go seek those rewards more and more at a higher rate, which then leads to addiction, right? So dopamine is highly associated with addiction. But at a lower rate, dopamine levels at that steady state, release of dopamine is very important for mood regulation, right? So when we have that sort of seeking of reward, and when we fulfill that reward, levels of dopamine goes back down in our brain, and then we again seek the reward. But if it's at a controlled level, then it's good. Similarly, oxytocin is a neuromodulator that's associated with more bonding experiences, right? So for example, a mother and child bonding causes release of oxytocin. And sometimes, I guess in media, it's also called the love hormone, right? Described as the love hormone because of that, but not just for mother and child bonding or, this aspect of mother-child. oxytocin is also important for any kind of bonding experience, right? So it is a hormone that's associated, even, if you think about rituals, in a way, a lot of times rituals used to be practiced in community, right? Like it was an aspect of gathering. And so that itself can then bring that aspect of love, feeling of love, right? And so it's associated with that because, when you connect with your cultural aspects, it can bring memories or fond memories of some
sense
aspect
of belonging.
Exactly. Yeah, very good word. Uh-huh.
So it reminds me, especially here in America, right? You're very isolated.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking this is a big one. And a lot of people think of this as a very, it's like when you say love hormone, it's very physical. It's not. It's very, I'm assuming it's not. That's not the only thing. It's emotional bonding.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And a sense of belonging. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Subjective, very much, that feeling that radiates in a way like throughout your body, right? Like that's why oxytocin receptors, this neuromodulator that acts on is not only in the brain, it's also in the body. So it's really interesting, right? Like how it can affect this warm feeling when when you're feeling love is like throughout the body, which is another, interesting fact. And then endorphins really quickly is a neuromodulator that's associated primarily with pain, but it's an interesting neuromodulator because pain actually causes extreme levels of pain causes release of endorphins to suppress the pain signal, right? And so it's a counterintuitive way of thinking about endorphins, because if one good example is, I don't know if you like chilies, but I love chilies. Right. And so
I do.
Okay. So it is a pain associated pleasure, right? So when we bite on a chili, it actually is painful, yet it brings that aspect of pleasure. And so endorphin has that counterintuitive effect on the brain because it is released to suppress pain signals. And then in turn, it brings this euphoria. So that's why, when you have a chili, and similar, if you are suffering through a lot of pain, many people describe it as a subjective experience, but things like being in extreme meditative states can bring that sense of euphoria, right? That bliss, that kind of thing. And so from a hormonal neuromodulator level, you see all these chemicals are being released in the brain and acting together in different brain regions, but also from a spiritual point of view, there is that aspect that we all experience. So
No, I'm glad you clarified that. That reminds me, endorphins reminds me of how nowadays people stand on that bed of nails.
Oh, God. Yeah.
Yeah. One of my students brought me one board a couple of weeks ago and made me stand on one briefly.
How did that go?
It went okay. Would I do it willingly all the time? My euphoria was after I stepped off of it, but I wasn't on it for that long. I was just trying it because he was so excited about it. But I want to call out, it has nothing to do with yoga for anybody else who's listening. Right. So where does depression fall into all of this?
Yeah.
So what deficiency is it? Is it a dopamine deficiency? Should we even think of it like that? Where does that fall into this? Because that's a very prevalent issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, similar to many mental health conditions lately, right? So depression, from a psychiatric point of view, right? Like there are definitions of what causes a psychiatrist to define someone as having depression, and there are many different layers.
Yeah.
There's time length, for how long you're feeling this way or that way, things like that. But I think more and more there is understanding that depression is a very, very complicated, and it's not just a psychiatric sort of illness, right? Because again, you can call it a brain body sort of disorder or condition, because you can see, in depressed patients, they also have changes in bodily function. A lot of time depression is comorbid with cardiovascular diseases. Sometimes depressed people will seek more food or other types of reward. In other cases, less of those, right? Like, so there's Sometimes depressed people have anorexia versus like weight gain. So it's a very, very complex sort of mental health condition, and it encompasses many different layers and things like that. But in terms of neurotransmitters, since you brought it up earlier, originally, yes, dopamine and other neuromodulators, also serotonin was another main one that is associated with depression, because that is shown scientifically that, depressed patients have changes in levels of serotonin. But interestingly, now we're finding that most of serotonin that used to be thought as something that's being produced in the brain actually is being produced in the gut. So gut is the main source of serotonin. How exactly it modulates brain function, that's still an area of active investigation right now in neuroscience, but that makes sense in so many ways, right? Like depressed patients also have gut-related issues and things like that. So, this hormone or neurotransmitters could be altering mood by altering many aspects of this brain-body connection. And so, yeah, I think depression is something that's very hard to describe, and it's also very different between individuals. So one person's depression is very different from another person's depression. Right. And so, something I think is hard to describe is what I would say.
No, thank you for that. I know it's, I took a leap with that one. I want to be mindful of your time here. There is so much that we can still go into.
Yeah, definitely.
But are there any final thoughts that you have to wrap this up, or do you think we've gotten most of it together?
Yeah, I think we touched on a lot of things. We touched about the brain, we touched about neurochemicals, spirituality, consciousness, very broad, big topics, that's, I think I would say, very complex. But, because we were gonna sort of talk about science and spirituality, I think one thing to think about is that even though, science and spirituality don't exist together, they've like sort of not liked each other in so many ways. As a scientist myself, and a spiritual person, I would say, I'm understanding that they don't need to like each other, or they don't need, science doesn't need spirituality and spirituality doesn't need science to be complete. But as human beings, I think we need both, right? I think this aspect of spirituality that brings, this aspect of awe, wonder, or wanting to understand or gain more knowledge about who we are is a huge driver for our health and well-being, right? It can allow us to transcend like the daily mundane aspects of our life and see there's much more to us than just, what I'm going through right now, or, these stresses may be something that's in the path of, this something I want to gain. So I would say maybe changing your mind, or just being open mind, right? Like I don't want to tell anybody to do this or do that. That's not my job, that's something that comes from within. But maybe consider, right, seeing things from both of these lenses, right? Like we need both. I think we need science to understand our physical domain, our objective domain, and we need spirituality to understand the deeper aspects of us. So I think those would be the things I would say, is like, be open-minded, just like, what these two paths tell us to do is always explore, in that path.
No, wonderful. Thank you so much. You took us through all these questions with such ease. I will make sure to link to where the listeners can connect with you. So if they have questions, they want to pick your brain on something, they can directly talk to you. I hope you will come back to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. Thank you so much, Abha, for being here.
Thank you so much, Arundhati. This was so fun. Actually, I have not done a podcast on science and spirituality together. So this was so meaningful to me, at this point in my life. This is where I am at, because I look at everything I do from those two lenses. So I think I am honored that you invited me to share.
Oh, come on. Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you're here. And we will, the way I see it, we have to circle back to do like a round 2 of this at a later point, because this is a never ending topic, like
That's true. And it's evolving, right? And
yes. And we have the way I see it, we need people to bridge the gap between the ancient and the modern. So this conversation is really valuable. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening. As always, if you enjoy this episode, please remember to rate and review the podcast, as that's the only way we can put this free resource into the hands of others. I will see you next week with another guest, another conversation. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.